Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our seminar, Leading the Sector. This is a digital leadership seminar on inclusion, equity and digital. And my name is Anna Kennedy from Culture 24. Really pleased to have you all with us today. I think there are still people coming in as I speak. Do say hi in the chat, introduce yourself. So today we're here, as I said, to talk about inclusion and equity and the role of digital leadership in leveraging inclusion and accessibility and equity, that vital role particularly that leaders can play in that scenario. So what we're going to do today, we have three speakers I'll introduce in a moment, but a little bit of housekeeping first. If you are able to, it would be very helpful if you could add your organisation name to your Zoom name so that we can track attendance a little bit more easily. That would be fantastic. To make you aware that we are recording this because we will share it afterwards, but it's only the speakers who will appear on there. There's the chat. As I said, please feel free to use the chat to say hello, to chat to each other, to use to post observations, links, respond to what you're hearing from the speakers. And there's a Q&A function. So if you could please post questions, we're going to hear from the three speakers in turn, and then we're going to have all the questions and discussion together after we've heard from the three speakers. So you can post questions in the chat, and you can also upvote other people's questions. So if you see another question that you are also interested in, you can upvote them and help us to prioritize the questions if we get flooded with them, which we might well, which would be great. So there's live transcript is enabled. If you would like to do that, then you need to switch that on in your own. You should have the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen to switch that on. In terms of a visual description, brief visual description of myself, I am a 50-something white woman with long blonde hair wearing a blue shirt and tortoiseshell glasses. That's me. So that's the housekeeping. We're here for 90 minutes. Our speakers today, we're delighted to have three fantastic speakers with us. Do you want to just switch your cameras on for a sec, speakers, while I give everyone a wave? So we've got Julie Nicholson, who is the Managing Director and the founder of Digital Voice for Communities. That's great, Julie. And then we've got Matthew Cock, who's there as well, who's CEO of VocalEyes. And we've got Kelly. Hello, Kelly. There's Kelly is an open knowledge advocate and public historian who wears loads of interesting hats. And we're going to hear more about what everyone else, what everyone's backgrounds are when they give their talks. So thank you very much, speakers. Really looking forward to it. Let's just launch straight in. We're going to go to Julie first. So the rest of us will turn our cameras off. Brilliant. And off you go, Julie. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen with you. So Digital Voice is a multi-award winning CIC, a community interest company. We're based in the northeast of England, but we work nationally in partnerships with charities and local authorities to empower marginalised people to do creative digital projects. We've been around for 15 years and doing heritage projects for 10 of those. Sorry, I'm just trying to change my slide. So we work with film and video a lot with people in a variety of ways, but got interested in heritage work because of my interest in local history and archive photos. And this led to an intergenerational film project training young carers to work with older people and to ask them about their memories. So they learned how to film those and make films with the older people, and the older people would take them around the village where they lived and talk about what that was like. We also do a lot of projects, as you'll see in the pictures here, with people asking them to archive film and photos and make a community archive for their plays. We started working with Beamish Museum, which is an open air museum, and it just added such a lot of interest to our digital skills courses. So they allow people to go along and dress up in old-fashioned clothes and go to the fair as it was in those times, the farm. It just really brings alive that project. And when we're doing filmmaking with people, we can go there and film what it was like back in the day, hear people's memories, and look at the old maps and archives. We go along and find photos on their archive. They've got an amazing people's collection, and that just adds to the film. So we're adding those into the films that we're making with people. So When Leighton's Industrial Past was a Heritage Lottery funded project, working with a group of older people and a group of people with additional needs. So we wanted to bring those people together because often people with additional needs don't get the opportunity to work in their communities, to volunteer, to get to know people in their communities. So we thought that this would be a really good way of doing that. So we trained the people with additional needs to make films, to learn interviewing skills, editing skills, and they interviewed older people in their area about what it was like back in the day, so 50s mainly. And then we went to Beamish to bring those memories to life. And both groups got such a lot from it. So the older people would collect archives. So they put out on Facebook, you know, come along, have a coffee, bring in your old photos, and then they would scan those, archive them. And the people with additional needs would come along and film them talking about it. So I'm just going to show you a quick clip from one of those films about the Hoppings, the local fair, which still comes to Leighton.
I loved the atmosphere. I remember in those days, you know, it wasn't long after the war. We were quite a big family. There was big family, so there wasn't a great deal of money around, you know. But the Hoppings was one of our highlights of the year. You know, we didn't go to Newcastle or other towns, you know, and the excitement was unbelievable that the Hoppings were here, and we had 4 days of fantastic fun, you know. We'd be there every night from school. Once our money had run out by 6 o'clock on a Saturday, and they did open Saturday afternoon, yes, so that was excellent as well, you know. So we spent the whole 4 days at the Hoppings, you know, fantastic carnival atmosphere, you know, and I loved it, yeah.
So from that brilliant project, which everybody really got a lot from, and we had a screening which was absolutely packed out. People just love to engage with those old photos, whether they want to tell their stories or just come along and listen to other people's stories. It just created a real buzz in the village. It was fantastic. And the group of people with additional needs wanted to continue to do that. So we looked at what other heritage projects could we do, and came up with a project called Our Valley, Our Place, where the same people came together to continue learning those skills, very simple skills, but using photography this time as well. So lots of different photo techniques, editing photos, using 360 cameras, and we'd go out into different heritage settings, National Trust property, different woodlands, meeting rangers, meeting Friends of Red Kites, learning a lot about the valley, but by using digital skills. So it was the digital skills that what made them want to come out, and they may not have felt comfortable to go, for example, to a National Trust property on their own, but because they went in a group with this focus of using digital skills, afterwards, many said, yes, I would go back there with my family or with the group again. So it was really useful, I think, for the group to have that focus of digital skills. and having something, you know, to feel that they've achieved something and learned a lot about the heritage. So I'm just going to show you a clip of one of the films that they created, which was at Gibbside, a National Trust property in the Northeast.
Okay, so my name is Lauren Cripps. I'm the Events and Programming Officer here at Gibbside, which is where we are today. This beautiful 18th century landscape garden. It's a great place for people to come and enjoy the sunshine, especially on a day like today. Most of what you see today is the brainchild of a gentleman called George Bowes. He became very wealthy through coal mining, and he wanted to have the best garden in the Northeast. So he ploughed a lot of his money into Gibbside, and he built the avenue, he built the walled garden, he built the chapel, and most of it survives today.
So we do a lot of work with young people and children in heritage settings. Again, we ask them to come along and work with older people to make these films about local heritage. But we also did a project with a group of refugees who, to help Tyne and Weir museums, did a project to help them to learn about local culture and heritage, and asked us to go along and help them make a film. So they were given access to the collections of Sunderland Museum and asked to choose some artifacts that they would like to make films about. So it really got them engaged with the heritage, with those artifacts, and having to learn about them all and then decide which would be the most interesting to other people. And it also helped with their English acquisition. So they had to write a script, film the artifacts, and make a really engaging film about these that was then used by the museum to widen their audience in general and to show what they had. So a really successful project, and I'll just show you a short clip.
The relaxing winter gardens and the objects from different cultures on display in the museum provide a unique backdrop to another world. Only few visitors have the privilege of seeing what lies beneath the museum.
Lift going down.
Curators like to call it the ethnographic stall. Some of the collection in the ethnographic store was donated by Edward Backhouse in the 1800s. Edward Backhouse was a philanthropist, Quaker minister, and a writer on church history. The storeroom is crammed with hundreds of objects ranging from pedals, shields, and swords to Chinese ivories and other types of artifacts.
When we first saw these Chinese shoes, we really liked them because of the embroidery. They were really delicate and they were only 3 inches long.
Really?
Thought that they were for babies and they remind us of our childhood. But the reality of these shoes is so different.
You just press pause for a second.
In China, from childhood, women used to bind their feet because they thought it was attractive, although it was really painful.
You just lost
the broken before the foot was bound.
Really?
Having bound feet made it hard to walk and walk.
Don't worry.
This practice ended in the 1900s.
There we go. Perfect.
Nowadays, women still do painful things to look attractive, like wearing high heels or going on summits.
Sorry about that. Everyone, I don't know what happened there. So what I'd like you to take away from this is that digital skills is a really effective way of engaging marginalised groups in heritage. And we think this works best when we engage with them first on their own turf, get to know them in the communities where they are, in the community centre or wherever they go, and get them involved in the digital project first before engaging in the heritage. So we train them, we give them roles within the film project so that they feel confident. And then we bring them into the heritage settings to complete the project. Not everyone feels that they belong in a heritage setting. So I think we've found that this really helps when we've evaluated with people. Investment in time and space for training, for me, is the most important thing. Learning how to teach digital skills is a great way to engage people who may not be your usual demographic in heritage. But your engagement teams don't necessarily have those skills, but they can be taught. So investment in that, if you're not already investing, is a great way to access new audiences. So we have a course that we run with both national and smaller organisations where we teach a lot of these skills on a blended 5-week CPD course. So we teach them to work with people to capture their stories, use archive images, and edit those together into a digital story, and feedback on its effectiveness in teaching engagement skills, as well as those all-important digital ones, is excellent. And I'd like to show you a clip from a digital story made by a learner on the course with someone that she supported and spoke to.
Joe came to the shop where I was working one day, all in his uniform because he was doing national service. And he said, I'm going abroad. And I said, well, where are you going, Joe? And he said, I'm going to Paris. And I said, what, Paris, France? And he said, yes. He said, if you want to marry me, you can come with me. So that was a done deal, really, wasn't it? So I just whipped round the corner with him to Rick's Sister Jewellers. Joe and I chose a ring. We got engaged. Then I went back to the shop and told the girls, I'm leaving. Why are you leaving, Georgie? Well, I'm going to live in Paris with my new husband.
So a really charming story there. But it's just great to engage people with archive photos and the skills, and not difficult to learn in quite a quick amount of time how to use those skills with your participants. So digital skills are key. People do want to learn those, and by giving access to your archives and your collections in the ways that I've shown above, you can engage a wider audience in different ways. The groups we worked with had never visited the heritage sites that we took them to, but it was something that interested them because we started slowly, we were sensitive to their support needs, and introduced them to the archives and collections in a way that was engaging for them. And the excitement of making a film and feeling they were working as a team to create something that they could show their families and friends and their local communities was just a real buzz for people. And most importantly, you can use the media that you create with people to develop your audiences. So we like to see people we identify with, don't we, out there. So diversity in your media helps with that. And of course, it's great to share on social media. We get so many hits off the heritage films that we put out there. It's just incredible. People do really love to engage with the past, as you all know. So I hope that's been of interest. I'll put me contacts in there's my contacts there, and I'll put them in the chat as well if you'd like to get in touch. And hopefully you've enjoyed that. Thank you.
Oh, Julie, thank you so much. That was really fascinating, and it's so nice to hear people's voices and see people in a session like this. That's fantastic. Thank you. So we've already got one question in the chat, but we will come to that after we've heard from Kelly and Matthew. So we'll just if that's it. Brilliant. Thank you, Julie. So Kelly, we're going to come to Kelly Foster, as I said, a public historian and open knowledge advocate. And we're just going to swap over. If you could put your camera on, Kelly.
I am here in voice. Oh,
brilliant. There we go.
Well.
There we are.
America.
We've got you.
Fantastic. Wonderful to be here with you on this very warm Monday morning. Just to give you a bit of an introduction to myself. I don't usually sound this husky. I'm just getting over what we're all getting over, which is this pandemic. So please bear with me with my voice if possible. Just to give you a quick visual description of myself, I am a Black African Jamaican woman sat in front of an overstuffed bookcase wearing glasses and a very brightly coloured Ankara or wax print shirt, one of my favourite shirts actually. Hopefully you can all hear me okay. If you can't, please do let the production team know and I'll try and speak a bit more louder. Now, Culture 24 gave me a very brief introduction and I'll try to expand on that. I generally tend to call myself a public historian, but most of what I do is around supporting archives and museums in building digital capacity. Currently, what that looks like is I am the Who's Digital Archives UK project coordinator for an organisation called Who's Knowledge. And that is a project to support building a community of practice for liberatory archives in the UK. And I'm also an associate of the Research Centre for Transnational Art, Identity and Nation, aka TRAIN, which is based at the University of the Arts London, and my area of research there is Black Digital Practice. In addition, I am a trustee of Wikimedia UK, a charity that supports people who edit Wikipedia, and I am the UK lead of Creative Commons UK as well. I'm very happy to expand more on what all those things are in the question and answer. But if I can just share my screen and I should get into the presentation. So hopefully you can all see that. Please do let me know in the chat if you can't. Right, so these are my contact details. I've introduced myself already. And the challenge that came to me was to provide you and to support a conversation around equity, diversity, and inclusion when it comes to digital leadership in heritage. And I think the most important thing to say then, or initially, is to get us to think about what equity, diversity and inclusion mean. Now, this presentation is peppered with quotes from various public intellectuals, many Caribbean ones actually, and I will try to read the pertinent points of these out. And this is a quote by Sarah Ahmed, who reminds us that the language of diversity can often be a way of avoiding confrontation. And it's important for us to think, when we're thinking through equity, diversity and inclusion, what are we inviting people to be included in? Oftentimes, the systems themselves are the systems that are built on historic harms and also perpetuate present harms as well. Here, Caribbean historian Elsa Gavina in 1958, the period of a growing independence movement, reminds us that oftentimes the shame about the past fills the place that should be held by knowledge, and that the knowledge of the past may play its place in our liberation. So even though oftentimes the way that funding often works is EDI is project-based, it is based within a particular department, I want to encourage you to think about and expand our vocabulary when we think about wanting to address harm, to go beyond equity, diversity, and inclusion, and go beyond thinking about it as project work. This is work to address systems that have produced harm. And in order to do that, we need systematic change. So how can we think about that with a particular lens on the digital? I'm going to be encouraging you this morning to think through the lens of, in particular, catalogues and collections. And here I have a list of additional vocabulary, which hopefully you will take into account. So how do we create systems that are anti-racist, anti-oppressive, anti-sexist, that may be reparative and have a transitional justice at its core, that may have a goal of equity or liberation, where we demand accountability, transparency, and where we make demands also for justice. In the case of the Wikimedia movement, and the Wikimedia movement is the global movement that built Wikipedia, the online encyclopedia, in around 300 different languages. The way that we, I've included myself in that community, have identified this is that we have set knowledge equity as one of our goals for this next strategic period. And we define knowledge equity as a social movement where we focus our efforts on the knowledge and communities that have been left out of structures of power and privilege. Power and privilege and addressing, recognizing power and privilege are really at the core of doing this work, whether we're doing it programmatically or we're doing it digitally, in working with the catalogues and collections within heritage organisations. And again, I want to encourage you to expand and think, through knowledge equity. And especially if we think about power over a period of time, what does that mean? So oftentimes we hear people talking about knowledge gaps or knowledge equity, addressing these absences. But we also need to think about how do we address silences, what doesn't get spoken about. So if race or even whiteness or class don't get spoken about in how our collections are represented online, and in turn, the power inherent in those racializations and in those class distinctions. But also, how do we take into account knowledge debt as well? So I am defining knowledge debt by, if we think about these knowledge gaps as being accumulated and compounded over time and comprising of historic, economic, socio-political and moral components, in order to move ourselves towards a more equitable and a more liberatory way that our organisations, that our heritage organisations function. We need to recognise that the issues that these organisations have been grown over time, and we need in turn time and investment in order to remedy those injustices. This is also a reminder that, like museums, digitisation is not neutral. And oftentimes these historic systems, whether it be your collections catalogue, or even whether it be the processes and the framework through which you are cataloguing or you are representing collections online, oftentimes these processes and practices are enshrined in a historic assumption that reinscribes violence. So this is a historian, Rupika Rislam, who works on post-colonial archives, reminding us that the technology of colonialism is the creation of new archives. And in turn, when we digitize that, when we digitize these colonial assumptions and perspectives, and we can replace colonial there with sexist, with classist, we are in turn re-inscribing these this violence, and this time re-inscribing them in the digital realm. The Barbadian writer, actually, George Lamming, who passed away earlier this year, reminds us that it's also important for us to take into account language, and that the name, a name, is an infinite source of control. So what does that mean when we think about how we represent our collections online? Is who gets to name our collections, and whose names, whose worldviews are in turn represented in the metadata about our collections. Oftentimes, in the archives world anyway, they talk about the catalogue as exerting intellectual control over the collection. And that intellectual control, obviously, is a control that has an authority from a particular worldview. So in turn, in thinking about addressing harm, how can we think about how our collections are represented online? Now, this is a quote from Arthur Torrington. At the time, the National Archives was digitizing the slave registry records. In 1817, the British government did a census of all of the enslaved people in the British Empire. Ancestry.com digitized these censuses. There was a number of different censuses, and they wanted to put them behind a paywall of the genealogy website Ancestry.com. And there was a long campaign from African Caribbean people in order to make sure that these slavery records are freely accessible for people who have been separated from their heritage. So Arthur Torrington, who was one of the spokespeople for that campaign, reminds us that free online access can be regarded as a form of reparations for the cruelty and injustice of the British in the era of African chattel slavery. And that also that archive records in turn were an instrument of that cruelty and injustice. And oftentimes museum collections, they're both how they were acquired and how they've been described and catalogues, are also technologies of that injustice as well. So Arthur was campaigning for open access or open licenses for archive records. In turn, there is also voices that calls for more consideration in who and what records are made open and to whom they are accessible. These are two examples of ethical frameworks being used to define ethical and data practices. So the FAIR framework and the CARE framework. The CARE framework I'll speak about first of all has been devised by the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, and it requires that data be able to give a collective benefit, that Indigenous communities have the authority to control that data, that there is also a responsibility for how that data is shared, and that ethics are taken into consideration when there are conversations about making that data open. And then in turn, there is also the framework, F-A-I-R, and oftentimes CARE and framework together. CARE and FAIR. FAIR requires that data is findable, A, accessible, I, interoperable, and R, reusable. And together, these give an ethical framework. Oftentimes, this is used in the realms of open data, but I think these are really powerful frameworks for us all to be thinking about when creating the metadata that goes into our, not only our collections catalogues, but also into how we speak about the collections online, whether that be on the organisational website or in social media. And this gives you an idea of how our websites are increasingly, the organisational websites are increasingly becoming secondary and even tertiary to how people engage with our collections online. This is a bar chart showing the average views of the most popular artworks in the Metropolitan Museum of New York. It compares, in the red part of the bar chart, it compares how often that art record is accessed in the online catalogue compared to how often it's accessed on Wikipedia, on English Wikipedia, and on all the different language Wikipedias. To give you an example, arguably the most popular artwork in the Met Museum, the Japanese print, The Great Wave, has under 10,000 views on the Met's website, compared to almost 50,000 views on English Wikipedia, and almost 100,000 views, so tenfold, if my maths are correct, on all the different language Wikipedias. The likelihood that somebody will engage with your organisation on your website is incredibly low and becoming even lower. And in turn, what we should aim to be doing is providing pathways for people who engage with our content on social media or in different places to make their way back to our catalogue or the other interpretation we provide online. Now, the way that the Met has done this is that they opened up and they released all of the photography they have for their out of copyright artworks on a very open Creative Commons license. These two charts provide you with an idea of the spectrum of openness available with Creative Commons licenses. Now, Wikipedia requires the most open of Creative Commons licenses, and Creative Commons is a digital license which gives automatic permission for other people to share, use, remix, and reinterpret digital files, whether that be text or whether that be images or whether that be video or audio. And by releasing things on a Creative Commons license, we are releasing our collections into a broader community that can support communities that are aiming and seeking to be liberatory and reparative and equitable. In contrast, we also need to think about how we share power in how decisions around open licenses are made. This is the key points from a report provided by two law academics at the University of Edinburgh, Mathilde Parvis and Andrea Wallace, who provided a response to the Savoy report, a French report into the restitution of objects in French museums that were looted from the continent of Africa. It's estimated that around 90% of African cultural heritage is in Europe, in the museums and private collections of Europe. And I think the caveats that Mathilde and Andrea give us are useful for us to think about when thinking about whether we make our collections open and whether we use open licenses for the digital elements of our collections. Oftentimes, requiring open licenses is oftentimes very one-sided, and it can continue to exert control over digital assets where the control should be with those communities of origin. It creates a double standard, very oftentimes, again, between collections that are held in Europe and collections that may be considered to be restituted to their communities of origin. Oftentimes, the digital rights digital rights aren't required, or a digital openness isn't required to European collections, but to restituted to collections it is. Communities of origin should enjoy full autonomy of devising any access strategy. And they remind us that to truly decolonize, we must carry through the treatment, or we must carry through this treatment also not only to museum objects, but also archival and digital materials. And the example of Glasgow Museum, which recently restituted some of the Benin bronzes in their collection. In addition to restituting the objects, Glasgow Museum also made sure that the digital rights went to the museum in Nigeria as well. So I've spoken very generally there, in conclusion, I've spoken very generally there around the frameworks of ethics that you can think about applying when you're thinking through power sharing and when you're thinking through strategies towards openness. And I've also encouraged you to think through the language that we use, and to also reflect on the systematic processes that are necessary to achieve the goals of equity and liberation. Thanks very much.
Kelly, thank you so much. So much food for thought there. That was really fascinating. And we've got observations coming in the chat and question already, which is great. So we will, as with Julie's, we'll come to those after we've heard from our final speaker. So all, of course, on the same theme, but a slight shift in focus again as we come to Matthew, VocalEyes. All set, Matthew?
I am, yes, thank you.
Brilliant, right, over to you.
Hi everyone, I'm Matthew Cock. I'm a white cis man in my mid-50s with short dark greying hair, and I'm wearing round reading glasses. And I'm the chief executive of VocalEyes. We're a sector support organisation working with and for blind and visually impaired people. We seek to increase access and inclusion in the arts and heritage sectors, mostly through audio description services, training, resources, advocacy, and collaboration with other organisations. I'm approaching the theme today from the angle of inclusion and anti-ableism. Anti-ableism involves strategies, theories, actions, practices that challenge and counter ableism. That is, inequalities, prejudices, and discriminations based on disability. I'm using the word disabled today to refer to people who experience access barriers, including deaf and neurodivergent people, and those who may not identify as disabled, but experience temporary or situational disability at the time of their encounter with an organisation. So this is very much the social and not the medical model of disability, with the onus on organisations to remove and reduce the disabling barriers. I'm going to focus mostly on volunteers and visitors and tell you about a project that we're running where volunteers help heritage organisations understand how they can better engage with visitors. And the main channel I'm concerned about is the organisation's own website, which is a key means of increasing inclusion and actively encouraging disabled people to become visitors. And to be even more specific, it's the access information page. There's strong evidence, about 95% in one survey, that a high proportion of disabled people plan their visit carefully beforehand, and mostly through visiting the venue's website. If people don't find the information that reassures them that their access needs are being met, they will often change their plans and not come. So if your organisation has no access information, or it's poor, has very little detail, you're excluding 1 in 5 UK citizens, and potentially also the friends, family, non-disabled companions who may have come with them. So we're involved in a project to combat this exclusion, and that this is the Heritage Access 2022 project, funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund in their digital volunteering strands. We've got amazing partners and advisors whose logos decorate the slides, who've helped design and deliver the projects. Access organisations, StageText, Centre for Accessible Environments, Autism in Museums, Ability Nets. Academics, University of Westminster and Leicester, and heritage organisations, English Heritage, Heritage Volunteering Group, National Trust and Wellcome Collection. And I should add Wikimedia as well, where we're working on some of the data that we're collating through the project. We're going to upload to Wikidata because we realised there wasn't a source of this data beforehand. We're collecting it. Let's make it useful for someone else in future. So I hope Kelly's pleased with us.
Matthew, can I interrupt you for 1 second?
Yes.
I'm really sorry, because I know you have some slides and I wasn't sure if you had started. We're not seeing your slides yet.
Okay, I have screen shared and showing my slides.
I thought you might be, sorry, I would have said sooner. I thought you might have been introducing your slides, so I hadn't said anything yet. So no, we've had you so far. So
I'm going to try it again.
Try again. There we go.
Okay, I don't know why it didn't. There was very
Perfect.
little.
Sorry, well, it was great, and so I thought maybe, yeah, as I say,
brilliant. No, thank you.
Using your slides. So we've got the title slide, the Heritage Access 2022 slide. We can see now with all the partners.
Yes, yes. You've missed one slide which gave a quote. Let's see if I can get to it.
Sorry, I'll be quiet again now.
No, thank you. Okay, I don't seem to want to go backwards. So you've missed one slide. It wasn't very exciting. So yeah, here are all our amazing partners. And with those partners, we've recruited a team of volunteer researchers who will, between them, will visit the websites of over 3,000 heritage sites across the UK and do a thorough check of the access information that they provide. We can't visit all those venues in person to see what access facilities they have, but the quality of their online information is a proxy measurement. The purpose of access information, it does 4 things. It provides a visitor information. It gives them means of contact if they have more questions. You're invariably going to have someone whose needs you may not have considered, who needs to make contact. You also need to do something else, which is to make people feel welcome and considered, and reassure them that the access barriers have been met and removed at their venue. This isn't just a moment of planning. This is a moment. This moment on your website before their visit is also a decision-making point. Is it worth the visit at all? And finally, linking through to specific access resources and information about other events, accessible events that may be elsewhere on the website. So basically, the access page is like a home page for your venue. So much of this is covered by detailed information, the first point, whether it's informational, so contact information, getting there, key features, access facilities, parking, lifts, accessible toilets, hearing loops, seating. It may be resource-based, visual stories, sensory maps, large print guides, etc. Or it may be, as I said, events that you have at your venue, British Sign Language tours, audio described tours. So we're going to publish a report later this year with guidelines on each of these, supporting venues who are creating their access information, links to good examples on heritage sites, and access and disability organisations for additional support. But it's not just about having a long list of resources. The other aspects, making people feel welcomed and reassured, is also conveyed more subtly in the language and tone, how your information is conveyed. Because there's been a legacy in museum and heritage websites, kind of as old as the internet itself, or as long as museums have been on the internet, of the access policy or the access statement, which has tainted the way that museums communicate with disabled people online. We don't communicate with visitors about the latest exhibition or event using policy statements or legalese, then let's stop doing this with visitors who have access requirements. I'm on a personal mission to get rid of the references to we, our, or the museum, and for this to be replaced with direct communication addressed to the reader using the second person you. So I'm going to give you three real-world examples of sentences I've found on museum and heritage access pages that gives you an example of this. First is the most legalese I could find. This access statement does not contain personal opinions as to our suitability for those with access needs, but aims to accurately describe the facilities and service we offer all our guests/visitors. It's a completely useless sentence, this, but it's really, it makes you feel that they're just covering their backs or another part of their anatomy. Here's the most self-absorbed one I've ever found. The museum is committed to the widest possible access of our collection. To us, everyone has the right to access and engage with our collection and spaces and to feel welcomed and valued. I'm not going to read through all of this, but I've highlighted the amount of times they talk about themselves. And remember, this is being read by someone who's come to this page to find out something, and they're being talked about in the third person. So I fixed it for them. So this is what it really should read. Welcome to the museum. The staff are here to ensure you enjoy your visit to the collection and exhibition galleries. And then provide a useful piece of information. Lifts behind the information desk in the entrance hall provide step-free access to all floors. So in the one before, it showed off about their lift, but it didn't actually tell you where it was. This is one of the worst I've found. We want to make the museum as accessible as possible, but it's a 16th century Grade 1 listed building. And because of this, we cannot modify it to better accommodate disabled members of the public. Now, I'm not denying that having a Grade 1 listed building does put restrictions on what you can do, but to put this at the top of your access page, rather than a message about how people who are prevented from visiting the upper levels of this building might access the information or the objects there in an alternative way, I've got no time for. So as well as the information and the tone and the language of access information, there's the final element, which is the actual accessibility of the content itself. Does the is that information on your website accessible to blind and visually impaired people who might use a screen reader, or is that video accessible to someone who needs captions on the video, for example, or audio description on the video? And digital content accessibility spreads across many things. It's not just your public website, it's your social media, it's your email marketing, it's virtual events like this, it's internal as well. If you have deaf and disabled people on your staff, then your internal documents, your internal meetings, your internal digital meetings, and your other digital communications internally, they all need to be accessible as well. In terms of websites, there's often a common misconception that the accessibility is based solely on the framework that your developer or your digital agency hands over when a site is first launched. In fact, the accessibility of each individual item, whether it's a post, a tweet, an email newsletter, is in the hands of each team member who creates it. It's not a technical thing, it's something that everyone can do with simple online training. In the course that we do, a screen reader user shares their screen and the audio of the screen reader software's synthetic voice. They talk us through their process of navigating, browsing and reading using the keyboard alone. Once you've experienced this, you'll never leave out an alt tag, right click here, or fail to use heading tags again. So if you come away from my session with one message, it's this: as a heritage leader, you shouldn't be making one person responsible for access and inclusion, whether it's digital or more broadly. It has to be embedded with everyone's daily work and practice. So I want to talk a bit about volunteers. The 50 volunteers we recruited as researchers for the project are almost completely from the deaf, disabled and neurodivergent community. We proactively advertised for this in the role description and favoured their lived experience when selecting. The project and the wider sector benefit from their experience of access barriers. We've provided 50 disabled people training, CPD and work experience on a landmark project that could help start or progress their career in heritage. They gain skills and confidence in digital and heritage accessibility, and for some presenting at conferences, writing, contributing to the report, etc. And we'll use this experience to develop resources to help other sector organisations run remote digital volunteering projects in the future. A significant element of the project are the online training, CPD and co-design workshops with the volunteers. So we don't meet any of these volunteers, they don't leave their homes, they're all, and they really are spread around the UK. When we recruited, we also recruited by UK region. We didn't advertise in any national organisations, it was entirely through local volunteering websites. And so we have our 50 volunteers are spread across all the UK regions, the English regions, and Northern Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. So there's a lot of online sessions. So designing these so that they work for people with a range of access requirements has been complex, and it requires budget, and that you have to plan in from the beginning. So I put on the slide a list of the kind of 8 considerations that we have for each around access and designs. So multiple sessions, different times of day, self-description for blind and visually impaired people, not using the chat while speakers are talking, because if screen reader then gets a voice clash, they're getting the real voice of the human speaking, but then the voice, synthetic voice for the chat stuff. So we have an embargo on that. Slide content always spoken or described. We have a BSL signer. We have an in-person speech-to-text reporter rather than automated captioning. We have breaks, transcripts, audio and video. The other thing is keeping, well, after those sessions, while they're working on their research, keeping volunteers engaged and feeling part of the team. So we've engineered every different variation of opportunity to stay in touch, whether it's group sessions, one-to-one sessions, synchronous, so they have a video call, or asynchronous with a text chat, and whether their connection is with the managers, i.e. us in VocalEyes, or whether it's with peers. So the collaboration space, the Basecamp space we've got is mostly peer-to-peer, while the video calls and stuff are more with us. It's become incredibly clear since the pandemic that virtual meetings, live streamed events and so on have enabled disabled people to take part far more than they might have previously. And there's also strong evidence that flexible and home working benefits disabled people more than anyone else. And this has to be the case for remote and digital volunteering as well. Our project and others in the loss refund tranche intend to model best practice here. This is really positive, but it doesn't mean that you have an excuse not to make your heritage venues accessible for visitors and staff, and your online delivery and virtual workplaces are certainly not access features if you don't make them properly accessible to everyone. And as I said, this takes planning, consideration, and budget built in. So I want to share with you a Virtuous Circle. I don't know if you can see that. It doesn't quite fit on the screen for me, but so this is one of those lovely word diagrams, and it's a circle with arrows linking a number of things. An accessible, inclusive venue does accessible marketing and communication, which leads to a stronger representation of disabled people among your visitors, which is strengthened through word of mouth and reputation. More disabled people will want to work and volunteer at your heritage site. You need to have an inclusive workplace and inclusive recruitment practice, And then there will be more disabled people among the workforce and boards of heritage organisations. This will lead to better awareness and prioritisation of access and inclusion at the heritage site, which leads to an accessible and inclusive venue. For this to work, everyone in the organisation has to be responsible for being alert to existing and potential access barriers and the task of removing them. You can't silo access and inclusion to be the responsibility of one person, unless that person is the organisation's leader, in which case you are the source of energy that drives this circle, using a collaborative leadership model to ensure everyone takes responsibility, making a commitment to access, inclusion, and anti-ableism. And the value that underpins this for you is what Rachel Caldicott, and I'll share a link to this article, calls systemic digital care. The tone and ethos of your organisation's digital communications should be imbued with this. It's a care that aims to reduce harm and grief, a care that removes barriers and creates ease. And this involves you and your team being prepared, anticipating and learning, and inviting and responding to feedback. At the start of my talk, I mentioned people who experienced access barriers rely on a heritage site's website as part of the planning and decision-making process. Rachel Caldicott reminds us that not having to worry or plan ahead, not living in a constantly anticipatory space, is a form of privilege. Individuals or groups of people with such privilege can tend to forget or ignore their privilege. Having a diverse team is the surest way of avoiding this. Thank you. So there are links to various things I've used or talked about, which I will share with everyone afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Again, really, really interesting. Lots of food for thought. So, oh, I'll turn myself off by mistake. So just to reiterate, so we've had a couple of people asking about slides in the chat, and yes, absolutely, we can share those. So we send a follow-up email to you when we've just, it'll just take us a day or two to edit the recording, and then we will send a follow-up email and we will share slides in there. But questions, so can I invite my speakers, please, to turn their cameras back on? And we've got some questions in the Q&A already, and I know that my colleague Jane, who's in the wings, has got a question as well. But let's just go straight to, I'm just going to go straight to the first one that came in, which was a question for Julie, which was, does Digital Voice for Communities have all the equipment? How much and what are the maintenance costs? Straight into the nitty-gritty.
So we do. So we don't expect the groups or the museums that we work with to have all of the digital equipment, but it's quite simple stuff that we use. We use iPads for all of the filming because it's really accessible, and you can film and edit on there using different apps. So the camera's on there, and then you get an editing app like iMovie or CapCut, something simple like that. Which even have music in. iMovie's got music, so you don't have to pay for copyrighted music, which can be expensive. And then we'd have a boom mic. Again, you can get one for an iPad, an iRig mic, for example. Other mics are available. A boom pole is about 40 quid for just a simple, bog standard boom pole, which is what you put your microphone on, so that you can film people standing away from them. A tripod, you'd need a tripod adapter for the iPad, which extends, put over your iPad, and then you can attach it to the tripod. So there are a few considerations for doing that, but an iPad is about £320 at the moment for your basic iPad. You need to think about storage issues on there, so get one with about 30 or even 32 or 64 gig storage. What else? Yeah, and then when we're working with people, a projector and screens. We have a portable screen, MiFi on a contract, so that we've got internet wherever we go. But obviously out in the field, when you're filming with your group, you don't need that stuff. But when you're editing, then you would, especially if people have got access issues, they can see things on a big screen. So often with groups, if people have additional needs, learning disabilities, we'll edit in turn. So we won't set them away editing straight away on their own or in pairs. We'll edit as a group, make decisions as a group, and edit like that. So a lot of training involved. But like I said, you can learn to do that and then pass that learning on to people.
Thank you so much. And that working in partnership, I think a key thing to come through there, your model of working in partnership with heritage organisations is a great way into this. And I know that you're not only skilling up the people in the groups you work with, you're skilling up the staff in the heritage organisations at the same time, aren't you? So that's a good way into this before you buy your own equipment, potentially.
That's it. Like I would encourage you to buy your own equipment and do this yourselves. If you can learn first how to do it, then why not do that with your groups? And the photography element as well. We do all that on iPads too. There's loads of different apps you can use to engage people.
Yeah. And we can share in our follow-up, we can share some links to some online resources that cover some of what Julie's been talking about as well. Thank you very much, Julie. Right, Kelly, question for Kelly. You've got a lovely juicy question here. So just read it. It says, I'm fully in support of open access. How do you think museums and archives can pursue this amid other pressures from boards and funders to be more enterprise driven and use digital collections for commercial income, e.g. reproduction services and rights? And are you aware of organisations who've struck this balance? And a little additional one, but you might want to park this one, come to it next. Is IIIF the best option? Because I think once we get to that, we know I need to explain what IIIF is as well. But let's go with the questions in one.
So I'll try to do my best. So the pressures of it was very delicately put, be more enterprise driven. And so that is expecting to make a profit from, or income, I should say, from your collections, from the digital assets created from your collections. I think it's important to remind ourselves as we're coming towards the end of the pandemic, that we all have a little camera in our pocket, and that's the camera or the computer in our pocket serves as both a way of accessing collections, and people have an expectation that the collections will be there and will be accessible on demand on our phone, but also they are our own little kind of digitization machine. So there just isn't the exclusivity of images as there perhaps was in the past. So I think oftentimes trustees, and it's important to remember that trustees have the sustainability of the organisation as their focus, hopefully. Oftentimes trustees have an expectation that they're going to make some income, and in some cases vast amounts of income, from licensing and from selling licenses to the images. More often than not, that is not true. I think most museums and archives do not make a significant or even an insignificant, oftentimes, amount of income from licensing their images. And I think the more examples you can give in making this argument to trustees, making the argument that to have open access to your collections, to support the mission of the organisation, and the access to knowledge is more important than the marginal profit in the enterprise driven, I think is an important one. The second part of that question was asking about, are there organisations in the UK that are doing that or that have made that argument successfully? I want to mention a few. I have just dropped into the chat a survey of Open GLAM organisations in Europe. Open GLAM means galleries, libraries, archives and museums that have an open access policy and that are, generally speaking, releasing the digitized versions, both, or in some cases, of their images of their collections, in some cases of the metadata associated with their collections, and in some cases both of those things, on an open license. This is a survey that was done by Andrea Wallace and I think it's Douglas McCarthy. Andrea, who I mentioned in my talk, is a lecturer in digital rights in GLAM organisations, and Douglas McCarthy works at Europeana, which is a EU-funded digital aggregator. But that is a really interesting survey to look through. You can actually do it's on Google Sheets, and you can actually do a filter to find the English, or not the English, the UK organisations. I'll just give you a taster. So Aberdeen Archives, Art Galleries and Museums, they are releasing their objects on a CC0, which means that if something is out of copyright, meaning that the creator of that artwork, for example, died more than 70 years ago, they're releasing that on a CC0 license, so they will not be exerting any copyright expectations over those objects. Bath Postal Museum releasing things in a public domain mark, which is like CC0. The British Library is an interesting case in point. The British Library acknowledges where some of their digitized material is out of copyright, but because they're the British Library, they do things by the book. The UK, since leaving the EU, it has complicated copyright law somewhat in the UK. So that means that the British Library acknowledges that even though something is in the public domain outside of the UK, in the UK, it may still be under copyright. So the collection at the British Library is more open outside the UK than it is in the UK. And so I think there are, well, let me do some maths. There are around 60, if my maths are correct, examples of galleries, libraries and museums that have open access policies. And it might be quite useful for you to look through those, see which are similar. Matthew gave us a great example of the information that heritage organisations give about themselves on their websites, to compare what their websites are like. And then for the third part of that question, the use of IFF, which I always forget what that's called. I think it's, International Image Interoperability Framework, which is a metadata framework, a machine-readable, interoperable metadata framework that should make it easier for organisations to share and to create tools that work across different organisations. The short answer to that question is yes. The long answer to the question is what they call now, TANK. What does TANK stand for? Towards
a National Collection.
Too many acronyms.
Yeah, Towards a National Collection.
Which is a publicly funded initiative that is aiming to get heritage organisations to build capacity, both within their collections around heritage organisations. If you are associated with a regional museum, you should be able to get access to the advice that TANK is creating about using IFF. In my opinion, there is inadequate support for more independent heritage organisations in getting involved in communities like IIIF, and it is a community that operates it. And then finally, sorry, that was a very long question. And then finally, I want to riff off of the work that Matthew outlined in his presentation, which I said in the chat. I'm very pleased that you are adding things to Wikidata. That is fantastic. And for me, that it was a prompt for me to remind the participants that when thinking about thinking about justice and liberation in how we think about the digital I use the word assets, but that seems like a very exploitative word. The digital representations about our collections, the metadata, in addition to any digital images, is also very important to think about. Both the metadata about the collections, and in the case, the project that Matthew described, the metadata about the organisations as well. And getting involved with a platform like Wikidata, which is a bit like Wikipedia, except it's machine readable data, it's multilingual, it offers vocality as well. It can give multiple senses of authority as well. Is a very interesting, and arguably is probably the kind of next phase for GLAM organisations to get involved with in how they think about how they're represented in the data sphere. Sorry for the long answer.
Don't apologise, that was a brilliant long answer. It was a long question, and thank you very much, especially with your bad throat. That was, yeah, great, Kelly. And Jane and Alec put some links in the chat about IIIF and the Tools National Collection as well. I just wanted to ask Julie and Matthew just whether you have any, at the crux of that question, that tension between being enterprise-driven versus being inclusive, because of course it shouldn't be like that, but that can be something that's one of the old chestnuts that we come up against a lot, isn't it? And I just wondered if, or Julie, if I come to you first, if in the work that you do, you'd sort of come up against that from leadership, perhaps, you know, needing to make the argument for the inclusion side.
I think the only examples that I can have is that the museums that we've worked with have been absolutely fantastic at sharing archive with us without charging for it. There has been one local authority that has put a charge on archive images, and even the archive images that we found had been donated to them by the Heritage, the History Society we were working with, so it was okay because we had access to that collection. But I'd found one on their website and said, oh, can we have that? And they were like, well, it's going to be £30, please, for that image, which we just hadn't got funding for. So, you know, we could build that in now to funding bids, and I completely understand that libraries, etc., have got to find funding from somewhere with all of the budget cuts, but I think that's the only time that it's become an issue for us.
Well, that's good to hear. Any thoughts, Matthew?
I can't think of anything off the top of my head. I mean, we're often working with organisations to create audio descriptive guides, and which invariably you know, they don't have to make them free, but normally they will do, because organisations will not charge for an audio described guide, because it actually forms the main way that they're fulfilling their duty under the Equality Act of making the collections accessible. So invariably they kind of won't charge for that. So we don't get much pushback from that. It reminds me though, when I worked at the British Museum and I was on the digital team at the British Museum at the time that the British Museum published the History of the World in 100 Objects, and they had the radio programs, and they were desperately getting the book ready to publish the book, which was the main way of making any income from that project, because it was on radio and stuff. And I said that they needed to make the transcripts of the radio programs accessible online, because otherwise the project wasn't accessible to deaf people. And this was before the book came out. And they were going, but what happens if someone downloaded all the transcripts, put it together, and then published the book before we even got it out? And you know, there was that worry, but no one did. It's people underestimate the you know, the desire. People want to have a book published by, you know. So anyway, it didn't happen. But there is that constant fear of, in terms of accessibility, of the, oh, you might give away the asset and stop people buying, you know, purchasing it. But it invariably doesn't happen.
No, thank you, Kelly.
Yeah, again, riffing off of both what Julie and Matthew outlined, and a potential activity for us, especially those of us who may also be volunteering with other organisations, as oftentimes people who work in the GLAM sector do. In the case of a regional records office, as Julia outlined, especially one that gets public funding, whether that be through our council taxes or whether that be through lottery funding, it's important to remind them that oftentimes it's our council taxes that are paying to upkeep the records. It's important to remind them also of their legislative responsibility for doing impact assessments on how access to that material would impact these communities that we're talking about, whether they be the disabled community or a marginalised community. And also sometimes it's important to remind them of the requirements of lottery funding. Of course, the National Lottery Heritage Fund, as I think the HLF is called now, requires that material be available under an open license. There is some room for negotiation if there are ethical issues about needing a more restrictive license. You can speak about that with your grant officer. But I think it's also our responsibility to challenge, when I say our individual as well as our organisational responsibility, to challenge institutions that may have these attitudes about a more proprietary view of open licensing.
Thank you so much, Kelly. Right, I'm going to just jump. We've got a couple of practical questions about your project, Matthew, but I'm going to jump because I think this one leads on nicely from it. So Helen has asked, do you agree that it might be better to ask people for their requirements rather than list things we think they might need? And in a sense, that talks to all three of your talks. But Matthew, let's start with you.
In relation to access information about a venue, I'm going to say no, because I've seen museums do this, where a museum said, I was talking to the museum about their access information, and they said, well, what we do is say to people, get in touch with us and tell us what you need, and then we'll tell you the access information. So what you're doing is essentially you're splitting your audience in two. You're saying, well, you lot can just come, you can turn up whenever you like, but you lot have to talk to us beforehand. You have to disclose potentially your disability or access needs and tell us, and then we give you the answer. So it's basically dividing people in two, which is not a great idea. So I'm going to kind of stick by what I said, which is you need to make everything you have available, describing access barriers, describing what you've done to get around them or to remove those barriers, and then let people come and make their own mind up, rather than make them, go through a hoop of speaking to a particular person at a particular time who may not be there. They may decide to go spontaneously, so they want to kind of look on the website now, So I'm afraid I'm going to say no, it doesn't work.
Great. Well, you might well have put the lid on that question then, unless Julie or Kelly had anything to add to that.
Just to reiterate what I said earlier, that when we start working with particular group with additional needs, so learning disabilities, it could be learning disabilities, people with autism and physical disabilities in that group, is start to work with them beforehand where they already meet. So we work in partnership with local authorities, community groups. We meet the people, we work with them over a series of weeks and find out what their support needs are then, and then we negotiate with the museum. So these are the support needs of the group. How are you going to accommodate those? And it's worked really well like that.
And I would absolutely second that. So for example, if you're having a virtual meeting, you should ask everyone to say, tell us if you have any access requirements. That's for a specific and in a group like Julie's working with. Absolutely, yes, you do it that way round, rather than you know, but this, I'm talking about millions of people potentially around the country who may want to visit. So they should be able to just read the information like anyone else.
Thank you. Now we're into our last 5 minutes, but I want to go to this question about your virtuous circle. So that virtuous circle that you shared, Matthew, sparked real interest. And this question is that the key part of your virtuous circle seems to be inclusive recruitment. Do you have examples of places that do this well, or tips for things organisations can do to be better than this? So I'm going to come to you first briefly, but then also come to Kelly and Julie, if you can be thinking about tips around inclusive recruitment.
Funnily enough, I was going to have a bit more about that in my talk, but I wasn't sure how digital it was. But some of the, so I removed it. But I'm just going to check something. A few months ago, I tweeted something about how we'd changed our practice to send all interviewees the questions 2 days before their interview, and this led to much better interviews. Everyone gave a better account of themselves, and people felt better about the interview. They'd given their best chance, and we got better candidates as a result. And this had come out of supporting a neurodivergent applicant who told us that they were extremely nervous about interviewing, and so we sent the questions in advance. I tweeted about this, and I think I had something like 400 retweets, 200 replies, and it just went. So I'm just checking. I did have that pinned on my profile, and I would just say my answer is read that thread. But I don't. Oh, thank you, Alex. Brilliant. Thank you, Alec. The other thing I'd say is I'm in the process of writing up our recruitment policy, and we'll put it on our website. So, and I've got a board meeting tonight where the board are looking at it, and so I can't share it until after that. But I will, if that gets approved at today's board meeting, I will send it to Anna, and she can share that link round.
Fantastic, thank you. I'm afraid it's 11:28. We're nearly out of time. Any very, very quick tips, Kelly?
Yeah, so on recruitment, I think it's important to think about who the burden of equity, diversity and inclusion falls on. Are you expecting it to fall on the person who is marginalised? Oftentimes when we're thinking about being inclusive, what are we asking people to be included in? Because oftentimes the organisational structures and culture we're asking them to be included in is a harmful and sometimes hostile organisational culture. So even though it is important to reduce as many barriers as possible in the recruitment processes, and I think Matthew gave us a great example, is also of paramount importance that we apply these approaches throughout the systems in all aspects of the organisation. And then finally, and this is addressed as a previous question as well, and as well as the point that Matthew raised, having a needs assessment opportunity, not only for experts or community experts that you may be working with, or potential candidates, recruitment candidates, or members of staff, you know, having a process through which people can talk about their specific needs is very important.
Thank you so much. Julie, we've run out of time. I'm sorry to come to you on that one. And Matthew, there's a couple of questions just before we close off about how heritage organisations were chosen for VocalEyes to review and what sorts of resources. So perhaps sharing, I know there's a lot of information on your website, perhaps if you could just pop the link in the chat to that page on your site, that would be great. So I'm very sorry, we ran out of time to go into detail on that last one from you, Lauren. I need to let you all go. So I'm going to close just before thanking our speakers finally by saying that this was the 4th seminar in a series of 6, which was is part of the Digital Skills for Heritage programme, which is a National Lottery Heritage Fund initiative. So we're very grateful for their support in this. The next one is on Monday, 25th of July, and it's at 4 o'clock to 5:30, and it's about digital enterprise in heritage. So how are digital behaviours and technology changing business models in heritage, and what does this mean for your leadership? So you can book onto that now, and if one of my colleagues could pop the link in the chat. Matthew's going to share the answers with us to those questions from Lauren in our follow-up, which we'll share. So it just need to just end by saying thank you so much, Julie, Kelly and Matthew, for your fascinating talks, for sharing your expertise with us and for your energy and time today.